According to Forbes, roughly 78% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, causing over half of U.S. workers to fear losing their job more than death itself. Yet Americans still spend over $300 a month on impulse purchases alone, spending roughly $18,000 a year on non-essential goods, raising the concern, how did consumerism become our way of living? While the United States has experienced unprecedented periods of consumerism, this concept of a relentless pursuit towards material goods is not unique to the US, and is rather the byproduct of centuries worth of debates between the financial and moral implications of a society driven by excessive consumption. In the early 16th century, European states and their American colonies enforced sumptuary laws to curb the desire of luxury and extravagance. The Venetian Senate in 1512 limited wedding gifts to just 6 forks and 6 spoons, banning gilded chests and mirrors altogether. In states now occupied by Germany, women were even fined or thrown in jail for elegant items such as a cotton neckerchief. These laws were seen as a veil from moral degradance, as individuals burdened with poverty could still maintain their virtue, and a society in endless pursuit of material items would ultimately invoke the sin of vanity. By the 17th and 18th century, as economies began to flourish, what were once luxury items were now considered common goods, and instead of punishing material pursuits, it now symbolized respectability. Societal elites now flaunted jeweled-covered tobacco boxes, impractical wigs, and theatrical dresses. But for most, the greatest luxury was a life no longer centered on survival, and as the restraint of desire was lifted, life was now centered on a greater pleasure of material comfort, marking this period as the Consumer Revolution. Dutch philosopher and economist Bernard Mandeville described this new cultural acceptance in his 1714 work, The Fable of the Bees, famously stating, "Private vices are public benefits, that individual self-seeking, ambition, greed, vanity, and luxury are indispensable to the prosperity and greatness of a nation, instead of such virtues like honesty." Despite criticism from other philosophers and economists who favored a life of virtue over endless consumption, the financial prosperity resulting from consumerism could not be ignored. Raising the question, can society have the financial prosperity that comes from the consumption of goods, as well as a life of virtue? In 1759, Adam Smith, known as the father of modern economics, wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments, where he argued that while consumption is necessary, it alone cannot ensure happiness. He stated, "Happiness consists of tranquility and enjoyment. Without tranquility, there can be no enjoyment, as before we can feel much for others, we must in some measure be at ease ourselves." In The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, Smith argues that one's individual pursuit of self-interest does indeed benefit society through the consumption of goods. However, he warned against excessive pursuit of trivial items, noting that many ruin themselves through frivolous spending, suggesting that once material needs are met, having now provided the economic prosperity for society, individuals could then pursue more virtuous endeavors. While Smith's work ultimately inspired American capitalism, it is Mandeville's approach that we more closely emulate, setting the foundation for the conflict that many of us face today. If consumerism is deemed essential for economic prosperity and personal well-being, where happiness depends fundamentally on obtaining consumer goods and material possessions, then how is it that in a world of endless consumption, where greed, jealousy, and hate is now the nation's status quo, that Americans hold over $1.1 trillion in credit card debt, the highest ever recorded, where 49% of Americans can't even afford a $1,000 emergency expense, and where more than 61% of Americans' youth feel chronically lonely? Unfortunately, I believe this to be a result of what Adam Smith and other philosophers overlooked, as it's not the satiation of the consumer that is worth considering, rather the satiation of the business interest, as the manipulation of what Adam Smith called the invisible hand would ultimately dictate the life of the consumer. In 1902, in an attempt to promote education to the common person, John D. Rockefeller donated over $1 million to help establish the General Education Board. However, the origins of our education system reveal a far different story. Although it is often attributed to Horace Mann, largely considered the father of American education, His model was directly inspired by his travels to Prussia, or modern-day Germany. Following a military defeat to Napoleon Bonaparte in 1806, Prussia's loss was simply attributed to their soldiers' excessive free will. To solve this issue, philosopher Johann Fichte, known as the father of German nationalism, argued that education should aim at destroying free will, so that, after pupils have left school, they shall be incapable throughout the rest of their lives of thinking or acting otherwise than their schoolmasters would have wished. When the technique has been perfected, every government that has been in charge of education for more than one generation will be able to control its subjects securely without the need of armies or policemen. Unlike Prussia's militaristic focus, American education with the investment from Rockefeller was designed to remove free will and replace it with the desire to consume and the obedience to work. Rockefeller's trusted advisor, Frederick Taylor Gates, stated, "In our dream, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present educational conventions fade from our minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive rural folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or men of science. We are not to raise up among them authors, orators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor will we cherish even the humbler ambition to raise up from among them lawyers, doctors, preachers, statesmen, of whom we now have ample supply." This engineered consumer mindset only further propelled into higher education. In 1913, Simon Patten, the chair of Wharton School of Business, summarized the new morality of consumption, stating, "I tell my students to spend all that they have and borrow more, and then spend that. It is no evidence of loose morality when a stenographer earning $8 or $10 a week appears dressed in clothing that takes nearly all of her earnings to buy, but quite the contrary. It is a sign of her growing moral development. Today, the average American has over $6,800 in credit card debt, with the average article of clothing being worn only 7 times before it is discarded." While this removal of free will ultimately created the foundation of the endless consumer, it wasn't until our needs were carefully manipulated and manufactured to desires did society become as we know it today. In 1919, nephew of Sigmund Freud, Austrian neurologist and founder of psychoanalysis, Edward Bernays was most popularly known as the father of propaganda, and stated, "The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, and our ideas suggested largely by men we have never heard of. As God did in the beginning, it is they who pull the wires that control the public mind." To engineer the endless consumer, Bernays stated, "Business cannot afford to wait until the public asks for its product. It must maintain constant touch, through advertising and propaganda, to assure itself of the continuous demand which alone will make its costly plant profitable." By 1924, to continue consumer demand, Alfred P. Sloan, CEO of General Motors, designed planned obsolescence, defined as a strategy of deliberately ensuring that the current version of a given product will become out of date or useless within a known time period. This proactive measure guarantees that consumers will seek replacements in the future, thus bolstering demand. Sloan also tiered the cars based on incomes, to consistently have consumers wanting the next better version as a sign of wealth to the masses. With Alfred P. Sloan famously stating, "GM existed not to make motor cars, but to make money." Today, 63% of Americans replace their new car every 5 years or less. Paul Mazur of Lehman Brothers further expanded this concept when writing in the Harvard Business Review in 1927. "We must shift America from a needs to desires culture. People must be trained to desire, to want new things even before the old had been entirely consumed. We must shape a new mentality in America. Man's desires must overshadow his needs." Due to over-leveraged subprime mortgages, high-yield securities, and leveraged debt, Lehman Brothers still remains the largest bankruptcy in history, involving more than $600 billion in assets throughout the 2008 recession. Just months before the Great Depression, the 31st President of the United States, Herbert Hoover, gave a speech to the young aspiring advertisers, stating, "You have taken over the job of creating desire and have transformed people into constantly moving happiness machines, machines which have become the key to economic progress." And in my opinion, I believe this to be just an absolutely disgusting view of humanity, especially coming from a president. However, it's hard not to see the similarities to how our democratic republic sees us today. Not as Americans, nor humans for that matter, but just mere consumerist happiness machines on trajectory to own nothing and be happy about it. Throughout the 1930s, the National Association of Manufacturers in the US assembled a team of advertisers, marketers, and psychologists to counteract government attempts to manage the economy during the Depression. Their strategy was to launch a relentless ad campaign that equated consumerism with the American way. Public discourse relabeled Americans to consumers and were reminded at every opportunity of their duty to contribute to the economy by purchasing factory-made products.
To talk about your ability to pass through price increases, are there products that you feel confident that the price increases can continue versus ones that you're like, I gotta wait on that one?
Well, I mean, if you look at us, we're a company that has $23 billion brands. And to us, $1 billion brand means it's a big brand, it's a powerful brand. Given that we've got such a large number of big brands and we invest so much in them as we have, in particular over the last few years, consumers generally look at our products and say, you know what, they are worth paying a little bit more for. While they may not be able to afford the big luxuries in life, for us, a little bit of an affordable treat, consumers generally feel good about that. So in general, the stronger the brand, the more the consumer is willing to pay a bit more for. In addition to that, we've been innovating quite a bit, whether it's minis in a canister or the Starry Lemon Lime product, which is a super tasting lemon lime. Consumers are excited by innovation, so they generally are willing to pay a few pennies more for that as well.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
Even radio soap operas became specifically written with the sole intention of what the show could advertise in terms of merchandise, signaling that at the end of your suffering was just one purchase away. Today, more than 53% of Americans have gone into debt using retail therapy as a way to cope with their emotions. Following World War II, as the U.S. saw remarkable economic growth and rampant material pursuits, economist Victor Lebow would epitomize the nation's status quo, stating, "Our enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption our way of life, that we convert the buying power and use of goods into rituals, that we seek our spiritual satisfaction and our ego satisfaction in consumption. We need things consumed, burned up, worn out, replaced and discarded at an ever-increasing rate." And with the help of television, a 1-minute commercial could reach roughly 160 million Americans, up from 8,000 households with TVs in 1946 to 45.7 million by 1960. And today, there are more TVs than people in the average American household, where adults on average spend roughly 3 hours a day watching television, being exposed to over 2 million ads annually. Meanwhile, to establish brand name preference, over $17 billion is spent yearly on ads solely targeting children, with the average child seeing around 40,000 ads a year. And unfortunately, this has only escalated with the introduction of social media, as the average American spends $754 a year on impulse social media purchases, with 81% of consumers' buying decisions being influenced by their friends' posts on social media. While society has been meticulously engineered and manufactured to squeeze every last drop out of the consumer, or what I like to call a human being, there is still one last aspect that must be addressed. Within the last 50 years, the median wage, when adjusted for inflation, has increased by a staggering 18 cents. While the average price for homes have increased by 1,600%, food has risen 736%, the price of a new car has increased 709%, with college having increased by 179%. With the average American spending roughly $524,000 in taxes throughout one's life. And at large, I kept thinking, How is the economy robust right now while Americans are hurting? How is it that we seem to be in this paradox of society versus like humans, mankind? And I think it's because it was never intended for us, it's not intended for us to be together like that. That at large, we are a data point for the economy. The economy is not a representation of the American consumer, of the American human being. Because if it was, we would be taught about financial education. We would be taught about how to be able to achieve financial independence. And as we are able to do so, that allows us to then do what I believe and what Adam Smith stated, to have virtuous endeavors and to be able to take care of ourselves and our neighbors. But the issue is that if that happens, if it fades us into our second part, you need division to create dependency. That you need us to be arguing against each other. You need us to not be a happy, enjoyable, creative, fulfilled society, because that doesn't print headlines. That doesn't make people dissociate from reality and sit and watch TV for 3 hours, or do impulse social media purchases, or use retail therapy as a way to cope with their emotions. But ultimately, it creates dependency upon politicians, as they are the gatekeepers that allow us to have this illusion that hope is just around the corner. That they're going to continue to do these false promises, that life will then go back up. We'll go back to the 50s and 60s. I believe that's possible. I believe that we can go back to the 50s and 60s, except with equality. We could make it even better. I believe we have the components for that society right now. But it comes from us. It comes from us being able to have the right conversations, the right interactions, the ability to love ourselves and our neighbor. That's how things happen. It isn't from the material good that you buy. It isn't from society's perception of you. None of that is real. It doesn't matter. It's a false reality. What is real is you on the other end of this camera. It is me taking what it is that I can to be able to provide this, and for us to have this interaction together, because I can learn just as much from you as you can from me. And then we can move that throughout society, throughout our neighbors and our loved ones and individuals such as that. The way that we beat this is we do our best. That if you have all of the resources in the world, or if you have none, if you're able to provide a helping hand and a shoulder to lean on to the person in front of you, do your best at doing that. And if you can't, do your best at loving you, because you are enough. You doing you and what it is that you are doing is enough. You are not just some number on an economic chart, and you're not here simply to just be productive. You are here to be you. And as Adam Smith said, for us to take care of our neighbors, we need to be at ease within ourselves. For us to do that, the more that we prioritize our own health and well-being, the more that we can actually make change. Because as we get out of this endless consumer cycle, we can throw a rope back in and we can pull others out. And that's how we begin to make a change. This is not an enjoyable conversation to have. It's quite discouraging. And I don't want to be spreading this discouragement among you guys. But this is discussions that need to happen. These are things that we need to be addressing. And I believe that we can do it. And sometimes you just need that permission to love yourself and for us to begin to just think about things differently, so then we can combat the real situations, the real issues at hand. I hope that this was able to provide some sort of value to you guys. As always, thank you so much for your time. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.
The middle children of history, man. No purpose or place. We have no Great War, no Great Depression. Our Great War is a spiritual war. Our Great Depression is our lives.